10 inventors who died awful deaths in their own creations. Welcome to Creepshow, where we dive into the dark and twisted tales that lurk just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. Today, we're exploring a chilling topic that combines ingenuity with tragedy. From the earliest days of invention to modern times, we'll uncover the stories of 10 inventors who met gruesome ends, each at the hands of their own creations. Stay tuned as we journey through the harrowing fates of those whose genius led them to the ultimate price. This is Inventors Who Died Awful Deaths in Their Own Creations. Inventing new things is a difficult and uncertain endeavor to undertake. As a matter of fact, there is no assurance that the ideas you come up with will be successful. The insanity of tinkering might also leave you stuck in the stage of trial and error for an indefinite amount of time. In addition, because of the numerous legal considerations that surround patents, new product marketing, manufacturing, and sales, even if you are successful in bringing your idea to market, there is no assurance that you will achieve any financial success with it. Sure, a great number of people are successful, but an even greater number are unsuccessful. Something tells us that there will always be a slew of inventors ready to improve upon some ancient technique or product. This is because people have a large amount of affection for fiddling with devices and coming up with better ways to do things. On the other hand, what can happen if the invention itself becomes dangerous? Forget about unsuccessful product launches or low sales. What can you say about inventors whose own ideas lead directly to their death? What can you say about them? You could believe that to be an extremely uncommon occurrence, but in reality, it happens frequently. In this list, we will examine 10 of the many instances in which innovators were the victims of their own innovations, which ultimately resulted in their deaths. So creepy. Number 10. Car troubles. Let's begin with an unpleasant 4-for-1 shot, shall we? Let's get these things started. When the automobile began to become a thing at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, it wasn't just Henry Ford laboring away in a factory with his assembly line. There were many other people involved as well. There were a great number of inventors who were working on their own versions of what would eventually become automobiles, motorbikes, and other forms of motorized passenger transportation. There was a wide range of engine designs and styles, and the majority of them were severely lacking in safety measures. Before even the most fundamental safety precautions were put into place, driving on the highways was a dangerous time. And as a result, a great number of people, including at least 4 very well-known innovators, lost their lives while operating these novel and peculiar equipment. The story of Sylvester H. Roper is a good example. In the year 1896, he was working on developing his Roper steam velocipede, which was essentially a very early form of the current motorcycle. One day, he decided to take it out for a spin when it was being tested in a public speed trial. His goal was to demonstrate to the world that his velocipede was capable of traversing roadways and transporting passengers over vast distances. However, he experienced a heart attack at some point during the trip, which rendered him unable to complete the journey. He lost control of the pioneering bike, crashed, and ultimately passed away when his heart began to stop beating. And sadly, he wasn't the first person to lose their life while riding a motorcycle in that frame. William Nelson, an employee of General Electric, came up with his own method of motorizing bicycles in 1903. This method was completely original. He painstakingly assembled the model, finally perfected the prototype, and then put it through its paces by putting it through a test run. However, he was murdered when the motorized bike he was riding crashed while he was out on the road for the test. Those who were responsible for the creation of earlier, more conventional forms of the automobile were also in danger. In 1918, a man named Francis Edgar Stanley, who was a tinkerer, was killed when he was driving his revolutionary Stanley steamer automobile down a remote road. After driving the automobile into a woodpile in an attempt to avoid colliding with a group of slow-moving farm carts that were traveling along the path in front of him, he did not survive the accident. And in 1932, the world of automobiles suffered yet another significant loss of an invention. During that particular year, Fred Duesenberg came to the attention of the public with his powerful Duesenberg automobile. No other automobile has the same level of power and speed as his. And well, it's possible that it had too much speed because poor old Fred was killed in a high-speed road accident that year when he was driving the thing. Over the course of time, his name and the brand of automobiles he owned have become synonymous with the fiery accident that resulted in the death of the proud innovator and courageous creator. Number 9. Otto Lilienthal. Carl Wilhelm. Otto Lilienthal was the first person to fly a plane before the Wright brothers. Lilienthal was born in Germany in 1848, and he began his career as a pilot when he was an adult. He is credited with being the flying man in his own country due to the fact that he was the first person to successfully fly using hang gliders. Obviously, he wasn't exactly traveling from one coast to the other way a contemporary commercial jet might. In the 1890s, however, Lilienthal discovered something that had never been done before. He discovered how to make a machine that was heavier than air fly through the air for hundreds of yards and sometimes much more. In turn, his pioneering flight attempts were extensively reported by newspapers and publications that were published during the 1890s that were published. Furthermore, this was a significant event due to the fact that Lilienthal was considered to be an expert on the concept of flight. In this manner, he gradually persuaded the general people that there was some value in soaring through the air at high speeds. Lilienthal's hopes for achieving glory with his crude airplane were dashed, however, because fate had other plans for him. He continued to climb slowly for a period of time. The idea of the modern wing, as it is known now, was conceived by and refined by him. He went so far as to introduce the world to the very first series of so-called airplanes, which were in reality nothing more than gliders, and he manufactured them in enormous quantities. However, despite the fact that he could quite possibly be considered the very first modern person to ever fly, his time spent in the air was relatively brief. When Lilienthal was out flying on August 9, 1896, his glider suddenly came to a stop in the air at a high altitude to his surprise. During the time that it was suspended in the air at a height of more than 50 feet, 15 meters, it slipped and fell like a rock. The violent collision caused Lilienthal to suffer a broken neck, and he passed away the next day. It is still widely believed that he is the father of flight due to the advancements that he made before the Wright brothers. However, it is unfortunate that he did not survive long enough to witness the advancement of aviation technology into the 20th century. Number 8. Franz Reichelt. Franz Reichelt was an inventor who was born in Germany. He established his home in France at the beginning of the 20th century and finally became a naturalized citizen of France. The reason he was referred to as the Flying Tailor was due to the fact that he had spent endless hours manufacturing parachutes, sewing them together, and perfecting their designs. In that sense, he was a pioneer in the field of parachuting. However, the fact that he was obsessed with the concept of being able to drop softly from a great height in the sky ultimately led to his destruction. Furthermore, despite the fact that Parisians presumably ought to have seen it coming, and in fact, many of them who were skeptical did, Reichelt's terrible death, which was tied to an innovation, was not only exceedingly public but also extremely gruesome. The ascent of the Eiffel Tower in Paris was accomplished by Reichelt on February 4, 1912. He had the intention of demonstrating that he had been successful in developing the ideal parachute. His entire life was devoted to the mission of preventing pilots from falling out of the sky in the event that they were compelled to abandon an aircraft while it was in flight. And after years of agonizing about how to make his parachute work properly, he finally felt that he had succeeded. Therefore, in order to determine whether or not his parachute was legitimate, he required the Eiffel Tower as a suitable high place. That morning, he was finally granted permission to utilize it as a drop point for a test dummy before the day began. On the other hand, when the morning in question arrived, Reichelt mounted the tower with his parachutes and abruptly informed the authorities that he was not going to drop a dummy at all. Instead, he intended to jump from the famous tower himself while wearing the parachute. He was planning to perform the jump personally. He told them that he would then fall on the ground in a secure and gentle manner, so demonstrating that his innovation was successful. In spite of the fact that members of the media and officials alike were extremely doubtful about this, they found a way to allow him to make the leap. And I'm sure you can predict what transpired immediately after that. Following the failure of Reichelt's parachute to deploy, he fell to his death in an instant. His whole fall was exactly 187 feet, 57 meters, and he was killed instantaneously upon landing on the hard earth below. His death occurred immediately after the fall. I hurt. Number 7. Michael Dacre. Born in the 1950s, Michael Robert Dacre was an inventor who devoted a significant portion of his adult life to the pursuit of figuring out how to construct a flying car, at least in a sense. It was in the late 1980s when he came up with something that was named the Avicen jet pod. Within the realm of transportation on a smaller scale, it was anticipated to be the wave of the future. To put it another way, it was a very small and quiet aircraft that required less than 150 yards, 137 meters, of space in order to take off and land on mini runways. The device was compact, effective, and exceedingly simple to operate, and it went straight to its intended location. According to Dacre's vision, it would be an airplane that could transfer business executives from one city to another. You could think of it as a medium-range air taxi. It would not travel from New York to Los Angeles, but it could fly from, for example, Los Angeles to Bakersfield to drop off an executive for an important business meeting or anything like that. It was even better than that since it was so little and it required such a minimal amount of runway space, which meant that it could theoretically land in the center of highly congested cities. It would not come into contact with commercial jets that are flying high in the sky if it were to occur at low levels. Its engines were also sufficiently quiet so that they did not bother anybody who were on the ground below. Doesn't that sound fantastic? Dacre was of the same opinion. Beginning in the late 1980s and continuing until the early 2000s, he worked closely with his co-workers and investors to perfect the Avicen jet pod. At long last, in August of 2009, he finished a brand new prototype of the jet pod that was just magnificent. Dacre, who was interested in putting it to the test, decided to give it a try. He made 3 separate attempts to take off, but each time he was unsuccessful. It was on the 4th attempt that he was finally able to effectively pull it off the ground. Regrettably, the jet pod became unmanageable and fell less than 1,000 feet, 304 meters, in the air, very shortly after the pilot had begun his flight. The body of Dacre, which had been mutilated, was discovered later in the debris. Dacre had been killed instantly. Number 6. John Day. Born in 1740, John Day holds the distinction of being the first person to ever pass away as a result of an incident involving a submarine. He also invented the very first submarine, which was a very crude structure. All throughout his life, he worked as a wheelwright and carpenter in England. In addition, He was completely preoccupied with the idea of being able to explore the depths of the ocean without the assistance of an airplane engine. As a result, Day constructed a so-called diving chamber out of wood with the financial assistance of Christopher Blake, a known English gambler. He then proceeded to test out his basic submarine by attaching it to a sloop called the Maria, which weighed 50 tons, and then setting sail in Plymouth Sound, which is located just off the coast of Plymouth, England. Ballast weights were going to be used to counterbalance the submarine, and then he was going to dive down into the ocean. After that, he was going to be able to come back up to the surface. His gambling companion Blake placed a wager on Day that he would not be able to descend to a depth of 130 feet, 40 meters, below the surface and remain there for a period of 12 hours. Blake's goal was to make a little money off of it. Day ultimately decided to take the bet because he liked those odds. Around the 22nd of June in the year 1774, the Maria was pulled to a position in the Plymouth Sound that was located just off Drake's Island. After grabbing a lantern, some water, and some biscuits, Day proceeded to board the homemade submarine that was at that location. Inside, there was a hammock that was designed to accommodate a passenger, and he was determined to wait out the 12 hours without any difficulty. In any case, it did not take place, as you have probably already deduced. Because Day's calculations of the trim were completely inaccurate, his boat sunk into the depths of the ocean almost immediately after he made them. He may have perished from asphyxiation, hypothermia, or a catastrophic structural failure within the diving chamber. However, it is technically unknown which of these causes caused his death. Regardless of the circumstances, Day was never seen or heard from again. No information has been provided regarding how Blake could have possibly won his winning bet. Number 5. William Pitt. Born in 1841, William Pitt was a Canadian engineer and inventor. He was born in Canada. He put in a lot of effort throughout his career to improve the flow of boat traffic. Perhaps it sounds like a dull job, but for more than 3 decades he was well known in the province of New Brunswick for the work that he did. Additionally, this was a very significant line of employment because people relied on his ferries to take them from one side of the continent to the other. To be more specific, this choke point was located on the Kennebecasis River, namely between what is known as Gondola Point on one side and Reed Point on the other side. To this day, people continue to rely on such boats to carry them to their places of employment and school, and then back home again. I suppose you could say that this is their equivalent of rush hour. Therefore, the people who lived in New Brunswick came to recognize Pitt as a person who was both friendly and extremely significant in relation to their distinctive way of life. The revolutionary underwater cable system that Pitt developed for his ferries was first introduced in 1903. The Kennebecasis Trail was the location where it was installed, and it was immediately put into use. Pitt was, in his own way, a conqueror of the local environment and the regional way of life by the time the next spring rolled around. Ferry traffic had increased significantly. All of that, unfortunately, came to a horrible and horrifying end in the year 1909. When Pitt was working on his recently developed and extremely original ferry system, he accidentally fell into some of the machinery that was located at one of the landing places. It was shortly after the fall that he passed away as a result of the accident, which had left him with terrible injuries. The William Pitt's Ecu is the name of one of the 2 ferries that continue to operate from Gondola Point with the intention of paying tribute to him. Number 4. Thomas Midgley Jr. In comparison to the other individuals on this list, Thomas Midgley Jr. could have the most peculiar and improbable story of how he invented something. To begin, he was the individual who conceptualized the idea of using tetraethyl lead to create leaded gasoline. Also, he was responsible for the invention and production of some of the very first chlorofluorocarbons ever made. These chlorofluorocarbons were better recognized in the United States for centuries following their invention by the brand name Freon. Due to the fact that they were so detrimental to both human health and the environment, both of those substances would eventually be prohibited from being used in an everyday setting. Therefore, in this aspect, Midgley is not exactly a friend to progress, the Earth, or the future, which continued on for a considerable amount of time after his death in 1944. However, the death that occurred in 1944 is the topic that we will be discussing today. See, in addition to coming up with some fairly dangerous inventions, Midgley also had to deal with the effects of polio. As early as 1940, he became afflicted with the sickness. As of 1944, he was absolutely unable to function due to it. On the other hand, the legendary tinkerer did not wish to be hampered by the fact that he lacked the physical capabilities to do so. Midgley, who had been given more than 100 patents throughout the course of his life for a wide range of inventions, made the decision to take action in response to this situation. Over the top of his bed, he constructed a rope and pulley system that was extremely complicated. In order for him to be able to sit up, lift himself, and get out of bed in order to perform tasks around the house, this would be possible. Yes, it does sound wonderful and motivating, doesn't it? However, it comes to a horrible conclusion. In the year 1944, Midgley was unable to escape the ropes of this massive pulley system and became caught in them. It seemed as though he was attempting to get out of bed when he became entangled in the ropes and ultimately passed away from what the authorities eventually judged to be a case of strangling. In private, there were many who pondered the possibility that it had not been intentional. More specifically, they pondered whether Midgley had committed suicide in his own creation. Whatever the case may be, the infamous tinkerer finally experimented with his final device, and it was while he was using it that his life was taken away. Number 3. Webster Wagner. During the 19th century, Webster Wagner was a prominent inventor who changed his career to become a politician. He lived in New York. In the 1830s, when he was still a young man, he joined up with his brother James to start a firm that manufactured wagons. However, by the year 1842, the corporation had already passed out. Particularly in the railroad business, which was experiencing a period of rapid expansion at the time, Wagner had many innovative suggestions for places to work. Therefore, he started working for the New York Central Railroad as an employee. The sleeping car and the elegant parlor vehicle were both inventions that he came up with while he was employed by that rapidly expanding corporation. It was credited to him that he came up with innovative methods that made traveling to different locations much more convenient and comfortable than it had ever been before. This resulted in an increase in the amount of business conducted by the New York Central Railroad. Wagner was so pleased with those innovations that he decided to launch his own company, the Wagner Palace Car Company, in the town of Buffalo, which is located in the state of New York's upstate region. Wagner was eventually able to combine his company with the Pullman Company, which was a competitor of his, after the Pullman Company was unsuccessful in putting his brand out of business. Wagner embarked on a career in politics at a time when he was already more wealthy than he could have ever imagined. It was in the year 1871 when he was elected to the New York State Assembly for the first time as a Republican. Following that, he was re-elected to fresh terms more than thrice during the course of the subsequent decade. Sadly, however, he passed away in 1882 as a result of an accident involving a railroad, which he had invented himself. On January 13, 1882, a luxury rail car belonging to the New York Central Railroad, in which Wagner was transporting himself, was involved in a collision with a train car belonging to the Hudson River Railroad. It was discovered that Wagner's body was one among the several that had been crushed between the two rail carriages. It was decades after he had actually constructed it that he was slain by his own creation. Number 2. Valerian Abakovsky. Valerian Ivanovich Abakovsky was a Russian inventor who was born in the year 1895 in the city of Riga, which is located in what is now the nation of Latvia. He was born in the early 20th century, during a period of rapid technical advancement, just like many of the other people on this list. To be more explicit, this meant that significant advancements were made in terms of powered transportation choices. Abakovsky was immediately captivated by the idea of high-speed rail, which he found to be fascinating. It was hardly more than an idea during Abakovsky's time, despite the fact that we continue to talk about that technology now, and countries like Japan are famous for their great high-speed rail networks. That was something he aspired to change, and he wanted to move it from an idea to an innovation. It was in his early 20s when he came up with the idea that would later become known as the aerowagon. The aerowagon was a high-speed rail gadget that operated with a propeller system that was similar to that of an airplane in front of it. With the intention of using it to transfer Soviet dignitaries, military personnel, and other individuals from one location to another at extremely fast speeds, Abakovsky sought to employ it. It goes without saying that Russia is a huge country, and the idea of accelerating the journey from Moscow to Siberia, for instance, was very alluring. It was unfortunate for Abakovsky because the rates at which he was constructing his rail car that resembled an airplane were too fast for him to handle. His death, along with that of a large number of other engineers and Soviet scientists, occurred on July 24, 1921, when the aerowagon was involved in a terrible accident. Only 3 months remained until Abakovsky's 26th birthday, and he was celebrating. Number 1. Michael Hughes. One of the names that you might recall is Michael Hughes. Mad Mike was the loving nickname given to Hughes, who was born in the United States and worked as a limousine driver before becoming a rocket scientist. Throughout his life, Hughes asserted that he believed the planet was flat, which garnered him a great deal of attention. After receiving that attention, he used it to generate money for the construction of his handmade rocket ships. And unfortunately, that rocket drive was the factor that ultimately contributed to his death. The courageous individual traveled to the desert in the vicinity of Barstow, California, on February 22, 2020, in order to pilot his rocket to a great height in the sky. In preparation for the new television series Homemade Astronauts on the Science Channel, he was recording the stunt earlier today. Hughes was the main attraction of a show that was devoted to people who constructed rockets and spaceships at home and then went to test them out in the hopes of one day going into space. The title of the show suggests that Hughes was the main focus of the television program. Hughes, on the other hand, never made it that far. Hughes launched his rocket and blasted it into the air while the cameras were filming, and there were journalists and members of the media all gathered to see his effort to launch the rocket outside of Barstow. On the other hand, when he soared straight up into the sky, a terrible set of circumstances occurred. It seemed as though the rocket's parachute, which was supposed to be utilized for a gentle landing, released prematurely and became detached from the craft itself. This was the case. Therefore, because there was no way to safely land in a controlled and gentle manner, the ship ended up falling back down to Earth at a fast speed, which brought an end to Hughes's rocket run and resulted in his instantaneous death. And there you have it, the tragic tales of inventors who paid the ultimate price for their relentless pursuit of progress. Their stories serve as a haunting reminder of the fine line between genius and peril. If you found this video intriguing, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to Creepshow for more eerie explorations into the darker side of history and innovation. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss an unsettling story. Until next time, stay curious and stay cautious.